So thank you all for coming. I'm really glad you're here. People from all segments of my life, and I appreciate the support. So to position my work, I do so in the circuit of culture. You can imagine a campaign ad might be produced in an agency, released in the world as a text, then read by audiences, and then later incorporated into lived cultures of everyday life. Now, my work focuses on this side of that circuit of culture, which is precisely why I invited Professor Branch from sociology and Professor Hemmett from anthropology to help shape my work. Now, the problem I'm looking at is race inequality inside of the U.S. advertising industry. And this graph kind of dramatizes the situation. So on your left, you have percentage of workers inside of advertising, and on the right, you have percentage of the general population. So you can see all minorities are underrepresented in the ad industry, but blacks in particular lag far behind. I drew on literature that looked at race inside of advertising, ethnographies that actually happen in real agencies, and then also the sociology of colorblind racism, as well as opportunity hoarding amongst whites in labor settings. So here's a little bit of my theoretical framework. I'm interested in power, and by that I mean material pressures and practices of everyday life, but also subjectivity, that is the ideological stories we tell ourselves. And I'm particularly interested in how those ideologies can screen or perhaps blind us to those material practices happening all around us. So, stated another way, my research question is, what is the role of ideology in the material reproduction of white labor inside U.S. advertising agencies? So to investigate this question, I looked at the internship, largely because the industry itself has framed the internship as the solution, a way to get students of color into the industry, train them, and prepare them for jobs. So the 4A's is the largest trade organization in U.S. advertising, and they have a program called MAPE, the Multicultural Advertising Internship Program, that's been in place since the 1970s. And so I conducted field work largely through the MAPE program in the summer of 2010 in New York City. I had 58 interns in all that participated in my study, and they were placed at summer internships at agencies across the city. Here's the logos of all 19. Here's how the interns break down in terms of race. So on the right side of the pie chart, these are MAPE interns, and on the left are white interns that I gained access to at 3 agencies where I conducted ethnographic field work. So all of these interns participated in a total of 21 different focus groups. I did 3 sort of waves of focus groups over the course of the summer based on issues of race, class, and then gender. Here's how those participants break down in terms of the surveys they filled out on those same topics. And here's a map of the pseudonyms for my 65 quoted participants. So throughout my dissertation, I quote 65 subjects that are in my study, and I sent my dissertation copy to all of them. And then of those 65, 22 sent in responses, and I'll be excerpting some of those coming up. So in my chapter on the ghosts of Mad Men, I looked at those interviews that I did with HR practitioners. And actually, I'm going to go back a second just to clarify. So on the right here, these are the interns from the MAKE program. On the left, you see folks who work as either diversity officers or in HR, or then other practitioners. So I got a little bit of triangulation in terms of my perspectives. So some of the findings of this chapter are informal hiring practices. So for getting new employees, they would use referrals through staff social networks, and then a team, basically organized around a certain product, would hire people really based on really subjective notions of chemistry and fit. Do I like this person? Do I want to hang around with him all day? Which ended up leading to a closed system of social reproduction. Now, here's why this matters. So you may be familiar with the show Mad Men. It's an AMC drama set in New York City, ad agency in the 1960s. Now, the industry still very much looks like Mad Men today. Now, this is a poster for the Clios, their award ceremony. It's like the Oscars for the ad industry. That's their publicity material in 2010. And an agency even did a Christmas card where they dressed up as characters from the show. And here's a picture of the top 10 ad agencies in 2008 of their CEOs, done in the style of Mad Men, with, I think, a pun intended there, that the makeup is very similar to the show, even though we're talking about 2008. Not 1968. Also, it's not just CEOs, it's creatives. They did a study of Super Bowl ads and found that almost all were white and male in terms of the creative process. Now here's how Georgia, one of my research subjects, responded to my dissertation. She pointed out that sexism is very much an issue. My dissertation doesn't deal with it directly, but this chapter brings it up. So earlier this month, executives at her agency were mocking a female client team. Georgia says, "I voiced my disagreement, but the entire table, including a powerful, smart female executive, agreed and laughed all along with the male C-level exec that made the comment." And then she says, "It is very hard for women to advance when these stereotypes are still enforced today." Dominique, I thought, made a great point in pointing out class barriers as well. She says that today low salary continues to be a burden for entry for the less affluent potential employees. In New York City, average entry level will be $35,000 a year. And then on top of this, you're expected to dress in a hip manner, and that kind of wardrobe can be very, very expensive to acquire. In my next chapter on material practices, I look at interviews with HR and diversity officers. And I found that there's various attempts been made to reform the industry, to fix the problem. One of those is a class action lawsuit that most industry insiders see as a bluff, and they pay no attention to it. Another is the NAACP contacted clients like Procter & Gamble to have them pressure agencies, but that fades over time and the clients don't follow through. And then attempts to frame diversity as smart have also failed to inspire action. Now what I did find is must-hires. Let me define that first. Must-hires are interns who are placed in their position because they know someone who is powerful, whether they are upper management at the agency or whether they have a relative who works at a very powerful client. They don't go through an application process, they're simply placed in their internship slot. So, and they're secret. You're not allowed to talk about it, for reasons I'll get into. So I found that these must-hires are a secret form of a white opportunity hoarding, and I'll explain the data that supports that conclusion. Out of the 75 interns at my 3 agencies, 24 of them were must-hires compared to 9 who were MAPE. That's the Multicultural Internship Program. The must-hires, therefore, outnumbered MAPE by a ratio of more than 2 to 1, and all 24 of the must-hires were white, and 13 of them participated in my study. So next I looked at ideological screens. How do we perceive these material practices? I looked at my focus group data as well as the surveys. And I found that both white interns and interns of color would use meritocracy as a defense, but for very different reasons. Whites to justify why they're there, interns of color to protect themselves from accusations of tokenism. I also found that race cloaks class. So Elizabeth, who's an HR officer, I was suggesting that these must-hires constituted a system of white affirmative action. And she said, "Oh no, they're not all white." And so I said, "Okay, can you produce a single example of a must-hire who was of color in the last 10 years? She hesitated, and then conceded my point. What's significant about that story is that she was unable to see that must-hires are a race-based system because of her colorblindness. She did not see whiteness. And finally, there was a lot of affirmative action backlash from whites, particularly amongst must-hires, which I found ironic, since they had been placed in their system based on no personal merit of their own. So my argument here is that ideologies of meritocracy undermine diversity efforts by concealing the underlying material practices of favoritism towards whites, while at the same time framing affirmative action for people of color as unfair. Now here's Gregory, who was white but not a must-hire. You can see in his statement here some of the bitterness that can emerge. So he told a story in response to my dissertation draft that he had a friend who went to an internship in Minneapolis. 12 total interns, 1 MAPE, his white classmate who was from out of state, and 10 must-hires. Here's what Gregory said. "The MAPE intern was put up at an expensive, fully stocked apartment for the summer, and my friend lived in the bad part of town where she could make rent with her $10 an hour intern salary. All the must-hires stayed with family." So you can see how this balances out. The must-hires are really crowding out everybody else. But the most direct comparison is between the working class white person who doesn't have access to the halls of power to be a must-hire and the MAPE intern. So the must-hires kind of get away with it, and then working class whites can then be bitter about the privileges associated with being of color. So I did a case study at an internship where the interns were actually tasked with rebranding their own internal diversity initiative. So I went there for the day and observed that agency, we'll call Agency D. I observed their intern presentations. Here's what I found. Amongst the six intern groups, the consensus was that diversity was a taboo term, and targeting themselves as the recipients of this campaign as being colorblind, as in not needing to think about diversity issues really, they wanted to rebrand it as inclusion, as in everyone is diverse, race fades away, it's just your interests, the variety of your character. So my argument here is that this suggests a fundamental disconnect between the material practices and ideological screens. So on one hand, you have the persistent race inequality on the structural level, and then on the other, you have this post-racial attitude on the level of individual subjectivities that's unable to see that structural inequality. So here's Chloe's response to that section of my dissertation. She makes an interesting point here. If diversity is the issue and affirmative action is seen as a solution, her thought is that diversity isn't what you need to rebrand, but in fact, it's affirmative action that needs new framing. And I actually couldn't agree with that more. So finally, the last chapter looks at black identity and the various intersections and contradictions therein. So this concentrated on my work with black interns in focus groups. My findings here is that the identifications for African Americans working in advertising are very complex and are often aspirational. I found interesting cases of class fractions in their orientation, the MAPE orientation. There was an activity called the race of life, and people took a step forward or a step backward based on their various levels of privilege. There was a question that asked about, are you a member of a country club? And two African American interns stepped forward and found themselves completely alone. And that led to a lot of antagonism within the black interns about noticing class differences where they had their own sort of blindness to class. So again, race can also cloak class beyond whiteness. And then finally, stereotype threat undermines mentoring. So a lot of the black interns weren't being taken under the wing of black staff at agencies for fear of being seen as forming an alliance or not being able to get along with other people. Now, my argument here is somewhat different. In the previous chapter, I said that rebranding diversity is distraction from structural inequality. But in this section, I actually consider the promise of individuality. There's a radical radical prospect here. So my argument is that though the concept of individuality may be problematic, it is also popular and true if you look at the theories of intersectionality, and contains with it the radical potential to challenge whiteness with cross-race affiliations. So overall, I'd say some key findings from my work are that meritocracy conceals the material practices of must-hires, or what I call white affirmative action, and that by making diversity into individuality, this undermines attempts to correct systematic discrimination at the group level, and yet also offers a promise of a way forward. And in the end, I offer some best practices for the industry, stop the must-hiring process, empower HR to make entry-level hiring so it's not so subject to fit and chemistry within teams, raise the wage of the entry level, also explain MAPE not just in terms of past discrimination but present discrimination, build cross-racial mentorships, honor individuality within race, both of color and whiteness, and then finally admit that when people say the general market, what they mean is white, and consider the possibility that interns of color may have insight into a culture just like an anthropologist would that may be a little more objective, that they've had to cope with it their whole life. They may actually see whiteness better than whites themselves. Finally, I spoke to Dorothy just 2 days ago, and she's an HR, one of my HR informants. And we were talking about this issue of referral hires and subjectivity and chemistry and fit. And what she was envisioning was the reality television show The Voice, where she would love it if the hiring process could be like this, where the chairs would turn around and all that you heard was the voice, or all that you heard was the talent. But unfortunately, typically, it's face forward, and all kinds of biases and ways of preferring people who remind you of yourself kind of corrupt the process. So I thought that was an interesting idea. Anyway, thank you for your attention. I'm so glad you were here. Before I finish, I want to thank my committee members who are facing me, which is nice. They've been so instrumental in both the development of my methodology and the formation of my analytical frame. I eagerly await your feedback and guidance. Thank you.